He called me redundant overhead. 3 days later, I froze the company's $300 million escrow account. Do you want to know how a fired contract specialist brought the CEO's son to his knees in front of the board and its top investors? Stay until the end, because you won't want to miss the quietest, sharpest power flip you have ever heard. My name is Natalie Burke. For the last 8 years, my existence has been defined by the fine print. At Everhelm Partners, a real estate titan that moves city skylines, I am a contract specialist. It's a title so bland, it's almost camouflage. It doesn't begin to describe what I do. I am the architect of the invisible. I build the cages of language that hold hundreds of millions of dollars in place. My battlefields are clauses, my weapons are subsections, and my victories are silent, logged away on a secure server that no one but the general counsel and I ever truly appreciate. I am the ghost in the firm's financial machine, the one who ensures the gears mesh without stripping. And in a world of loud voices, backslapping salesmen, and charismatic executives, being invisible was my superpower. Until it became my liability. The office is an ecosystem of calculated indifference, a sea of muted grays and steel blues, where the loudest sound is the persistent sterile hum of the HVAC system. People don't have conversations. They have strategic touch bases. They don't have friends. They have allies. I navigate this world with practiced quietness. My desk, tucked into a corner of the legal floor, is an island of meticulous order. While others clutter their spaces with family photos and motivational posters, mine holds only a single healthy succulent, a testament to my belief that some things can thrive even in a sterile, sunless environment. I arrive at 7:30 a.m., before the din of ambition begins, and I often leave after the cleaning crews have started their rounds, the scent of industrial lemon cleaner hanging in the air. This is where I find my solace in the quiet precision of my work. When I draft a 10-figure escrow agreement, I feel a sense of profound control. I can anticipate every potential loophole, every legal ambush, and I can build a fortress of words to protect the firm's capital. I am good at my job. I am, in fact, one of the best. But no one claps for the person who prevents the fire. They only notice you when the building is already in ashes. Then came Mason Crowley. He didn't walk through the office, he stormed it. As the CEO's son, he carried an aura of unearned authority, like a cheap cologne, overpowering and impossible to ignore. Freshly minted with the title Vice President of Mergers and Acquisitions that he wore like a varsity jacket, Mason was the embodiment of the new corporate ethos, loud, fast, and dismissive of anything that couldn't be summarized in a bullet point on a PowerPoint slide. He spoke in a dialect of buzzwords, a constant stream of synergy, disruption, and optimizing the value chain. To him, the company wasn't a complex organism built over decades. It was a race car, and his only job was to slam his foot on the accelerator. Details to Mason were friction. They were obstacles to his glorious high-speed vision. And I, Natalie Burke, was nothing but details. The clash was inevitable. It happened in the main boardroom on the 47th floor, a glass-walled cage overlooking the city. The air was thick with the pretense of collaboration. Mason was at the head of the long mahogany table, gesturing wildly at a screen displaying a garish chart with an arrow pointing aggressively upward. He was presenting the crown jewel of his 90-day tenure, a $300 million acquisition of a commercial property portfolio. It was a big deal, a game changer, as he'd called it in 3 separate emails that morning. The final papers were set to be signed, and the funds released from escrow within the week. I sat silently through most of it, listening. My job wasn't to applaud the vision. It was to ensure the vision didn't collapse on a technicality. As he finished his triumphant speech, he opened the floor to questions, his smile wide and predatory, daring anyone to challenge him. I raised a single finger. "Mason," I said, my voice calm and even, "regarding the escrow transfer for the Northgate portfolio, I just want to confirm that the third-party validation for Clause 9F has been cross-referenced and logged. The transfer trigger is time-sensitive, and requires an independent audit before the funds can be moved. The room went quiet. It was a simple procedural question, a checkbox on a long list of checkboxes I was responsible for. But to Mason, it wasn't a question. It was a speed bump. His smile tightened. He didn't even look at the documents in front of him. He looked directly at me, his eyes scanning me as if I were a piece of outdated office equipment. "That's old school thinking, Natalie," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The entire room could feel the shift. This was no longer a meeting. It was an execution. "We're moving lean. We're agile. We can't get bogged down in legacy processes that slow down progress." He gestured vaguely at me. "Frankly, that kind of granular focus isn't aligned with our new dynamic strategy. We need people who see the big picture." He turned back to the room, dismissing me entirely. "You're part of the old guard. Redundant overhead. Thanks for your input." The words hung in the air, each one a small, sharp stone thrown at my face. I felt the heat crawl up my neck. I could feel the eyes of my colleagues on me, some with pity, most with the cold, calculating relief that it wasn't them. In that moment, I was no longer the invisible architect. I was a visible obstruction. I said nothing. I simply lowered my hand, my face a placid mask, and made a small note on my legal pad. Inside, a cold, hard knot of fury was solidifying in my stomach. Redundant overhead. The woman who built the legal fortress around his $300 million prize was redundant overhead. Back at my desk, the sterile hum of the HVAC seemed to mock me. I didn't open my email. I didn't review my meeting notes. I opened a single heavily encrypted file on the firm's legal server. It was the master log for the Northgate deal. My eyes scanned the timestamps, the digital signatures, the chain of custody for the documents. And there it was, a glowing red flag that only I would know how to look for. 3 weeks ago at 4:15 a.m., Mason had received the preliminary audit report for Clause 9F. The report had a query, a minor discrepancy that needed to be resolved before the final validation could be issued. The standard procedure was to flag it, send it to my team, and wait for confirmation. It would have taken a day, maybe 2. But a delay, even for a day, would have messed with his aggressive timeline. The log showed his digital signature on a bypass authorization. He had personally overridden the query, attaching a note, "Executive decision to proceed. Final validation pending to be reconciled post-transfer." He had broken the cardinal rule of escrow. He had, in his haste and arrogance, created a fatal flaw in the integrity of the deal. He had signed off on a conditional transfer as if it were unconditional, and he had left a permanent, unalterable digital footprint of his recklessness. Staring at the screen at the proof of his incompetence, the humiliation from the boardroom began to morph into something else. It was a cold, clear, and potent resolve. He had called me redundant. He had called my meticulous work a legacy process. But that legacy process, that fine print he so arrogantly dismissed, was now the only thing that mattered. He didn't know it yet, but Mason Crowley hadn't just insulted a contract specialist. He had armed her. The hours that followed the meeting bled into one another, marked only by the slow emptying of the office floor. The symphony of ambition faded from a roar to a murmur, then to the solitary click of my keyboard. I wasn't working. I was excavating. Mason's digital signature on the bypass authorization wasn't just a mistake. It was a key. It unlocked the entire history of the Northgate deal's legal framework, and I was following the trail back to its source. The feeling wasn't one of frantic discovery, but of a slow, chilling confirmation of something I already suspected: arrogance is always sloppy. The core of the issue lay deep within the architecture of the agreement, in a section I had personally drafted 2 years prior. We called it the Covenant Series, a set of interlocking clauses designed to protect the firm from bad faith actors and internal negligence. Clause 9F. The one I'd mentioned in the meeting was the linchpin. Its official title was Escrow Security and Third-Party Audit Compliance, but I privately thought of it as the deal's conscience. It stipulated a mandatory 10-day transfer trigger delay. This wasn't just a waiting period. It was an active verification window. Once the preliminary terms were agreed upon, an independent auditor had to validate every single financial and legal representation. Only after that validation was logged would a joint notification be sent to both Everhelm and the seller's legal team, officially starting the 10-day countdown to the money moving. It was a fail-safe designed to prevent exactly what Mason had done, pushing a deal through on promises and sorting out the details later. My blood ran cold as I cross-referenced the server logs. Mason hadn't just bypassed the audit query, he had effectively nullified the trigger. By filing the executive decision to proceed, he had created a phantom timeline. On our system, it looked like the deal was moving forward. But the trigger for the 10-day delay was the auditor's final report, not Mason's whim. That report was never filed. Therefore, the notification to the seller's legal team was never sent. According to the letter of the contract, the very letters I had arranged into an ironclad sentence, the 10-day clock had never even started. The $300 million was sitting in an escrow account governed by a set of conditions that were not being met, all because the CEO's son was in a hurry. The weight of this discovery was immense. It was a feeling of profound, isolating clarity. I had spent my career building invisible fences to protect the firm, and now I was the only one who knew the gate was wide open. Anyone with standing could file an internal complaint, which would legally compel the escrow agent, a neutral third party, to freeze the funds until the discrepancy was resolved. The injustice of it was a physical ache in my chest. I felt like a watchmaker who had just been told her life's work was obsolete by someone who couldn't even tell time, only to find him smashing the gears of the company's most important clock. And then I found the second piece. On our shared drive, the current version of the Northgate Agreement was a clean, streamlined document, a result of Mason's new agile workflow. But I am a creature of habit, a product of an older, more cautious school of thought. I don't trust the cloud. I don't trust digital-only records. 6 months ago, when Mason's team took over the deal, I had printed a complete hard copy of the fully executed original agreement. The one before their efficiency edits. It was sitting in a locked file drawer in my desk, a drawer Mason probably thought held nothing more than spare pens and tea bags. That hard copy contained the original unabridged text of Clause 9F, complete with my handwritten annotations in the margins from the initial negotiation. It was the master text, the source code, and I, the redundant overhead, was the only person left who possessed it. I finally packed my briefcase around 9 p.m., the office a cavern of dark screens and empty chairs. The city lights outside the panoramic windows seemed impossibly distant, a galaxy of lives that were not mine. My own reflection in the glass was a pale, tired ghost. On the silent train ride home, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track was a metronome counting down to a deadline only I knew was a fiction. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt profoundly alone, burdened by a truth no one else wanted to hear. When I got to my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark, the city glow filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. I opened my laptop, and out of a morbid sense of curiosity, I navigated to LinkedIn. And there it was. A new post from Mason Crowley published an hour ago. It was a photo of him and his M&A team, all of them young, beaming, standing in the same boardroom where I had been dismissed. They looked like the cast of a television show about business, not people who actually did it. The caption was a masterclass in corporate self-congratulation. Incredibly proud to announce that my team at Everhelm Partners has just locked in a record-breaking $300 million acquisition. This is what agile leadership and a forward-thinking strategy can achieve. We're not just building a portfolio, we're building the future. A huge thank you to the best M&A team in the business for making it happen. Real estate, mergers, and acquisitions. Winning. Everhelm. I read it once, then twice. My knuckles were white where I gripped my laptop. The rage that had been a cold knot in my stomach now ignited, spreading like a chemical fire through my veins. He was taking a victory lap. He was planting his flag on a mountain he hadn't even finished climbing using a map he hadn't bothered to read. He had erased me from the narrative completely. The years of meticulous work, the late nights, the unwavering dedication, it was all just redundant overhead, swept away to make room for his polished, hollow success. He hadn't just dismissed me. He had made me invisible again, but this time it felt like an act of deliberate annihilation. I closed the laptop. The quiet of my apartment was absolute. The feeling of being abandoned, of being wronged, was no longer a passive ache. It was a sharpened instrument. He thought the fine print was a relic of the past. I was about to show him that the past has a way of becoming the present with devastating force. He wanted to build the future, but he had forgotten that the future is always built on the foundation of what came before. And I had written the blueprint. Sleep did not come. Instead, I lay in the pre-dawn gray, the city still hushed, and let the plan crystallize. Rage is a fire that consumes itself, leaving nothing but ash. What I felt now was different. It was the cold, unyielding pressure of deep ocean water, immense, silent, and capable of crushing steel. Mason Crowley and Everhelm Partners operated in a world of perception of LinkedIn posts and confident projections. I was about to reintroduce them to the world of consequence. By the time the first hints of sunlight touched the window panes, I was at my small desk, a laptop, and a single cup of black coffee, my only companions. I wasn't an Everhelm employee this morning. I was someone else entirely. Years ago, before the corporate world had seemed like a stable, long-term path, I had dabbled in freelance contract review for smaller firms. To do so, I'd gone through the tedious but necessary process of forming a limited liability company. It was a simple one-person operation, a legal shell to protect my personal assets and lend an air of professionalism to my side work. I had named it, with the straightforward lack of imagination of a lawyer, Burke Strategic Legal Review, LLC. It had been dormant for 5 years, a forgotten relic of a different path, its annual registration fee a minor automatic debit from my checking account. Now it was about to become the most important entity in a $300 million transaction. I logged into the Secretary of State's online business portal. My fingers moved with a steady, practiced rhythm. I entered the LLC's registration number, paid the fee to have its status certified as active and in good standing, and downloaded the official certificate. It was a simple PDF, but at that moment it felt like a declaration of independence. Burke Strategic Legal Review was a legitimate, legally recognized entity. It had a voice, and it had rights. Next, I began to draft the letter. This was my art form. The document had to be perfect, a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. It could contain no emotion, no hint of personal grievance. It had to be a dispassionate professional inquiry from one legal entity to another. I addressed it to Mr. Alistair Finch, the senior escrow officer at Ironclad Title and Escrow, the firm managing the Northgate funds. He was a man I'd never met, but whose reputation for being a stickler for protocol was legendary. He was a man who respected the fine print. The letter began by identifying my LLC. Re-inquiry. Concerning escrow account 774 A2 NRTG. Everhelm Partners, Northgate Holdings. Dear Mr. Finch, this letter is to serve as a formal inquiry on behalf of Burke Strategic Legal Review, LLC, an independent advisory firm with an interest in the procedural integrity of the above-referenced transaction. Our firm has reason to believe that a potential discrepancy exists regarding the fulfillment of specific preconditions for the disbursement of funds. The language was deliberately vague, but professionally ominous. An interest in the procedural integrity was a beautiful, hollow phrase. It asserted standing without needing to define it. It was a ghost knocking on the door. Specifically, we request immediate verification of the execution status of Clause 9F of the governing agreement subtitled Escrow Security and Third-Party Audit Compliance. A preliminary review of the available transaction timeline suggests a possible conflict in the conditions precedent to the activation of the stipulated transfer trigger delay. I didn't accuse. I didn't claim wrongdoing. I used the language of caution. Potential discrepancy. Possible conflict. Preliminary review. I was not an enemy. I was a diligent professional pointing out a wrinkle that they, as the neutral party, were legally obligated to iron out. I was helping them do their job. This was the most critical part of the strategy. You don't get a man like Alistair Finch to act by yelling at him. You get him to act by making him afraid of not acting, by subtly implying that a procedural lapse may have occurred on his watch. As per standard escrow and title insurance protocols, we formally request that a temporary administrative hold be placed on the disbursement of any and all funds from account number 774 A2 NRTG until Ironclad Title and Escrow can provide written confirmation that all conditions of Clause 9F have been met in their entirety as specified in the original fully executed contract. We trust you will agree that this measure is a prudent step to ensure the security and legal soundness of the transaction for all parties involved. I read the final paragraph over and over. Temporary administrative hold. It sounded so benign, so bureaucratic. Yet it was the legal equivalent of pulling the emergency brake on a speeding train. And the final sentence was the masterstroke aligning my request with their own self-interest. I wasn't asking them to take my side. I was asking them to protect themselves. Then came the signature. I typed my name. Beneath it, I did not type Contract Specialist Everhelm Partners. That person was a ghost, a line item of redundant overhead. That person had no power. Instead, I typed, Sincerely, Natalie Burke, Principal, Burke Strategic Legal Review, LLC. I stared at the words on the screen. Principal. It was a title I had given myself years ago for a company that existed only on paper. Today it felt more real than the title I held for 8 years. I attached the certificate of good standing for the LLC as an official exhibit. I took a deep breath, the air in my quiet apartment feeling charged with immense potential. Then I clicked send. The email disappeared from my outbox with a faint whoosh. A silent digital arrow shot into the heart of Mason Crowley's empire. There would be no immediate explosion. It would land quietly on a server on a Saturday morning. It would sit there until Monday, a small ticking bomb waiting for a man who respected the rules to open it. Walking into the office on Monday morning was like entering a theater after the show has been canceled. The energy was off. The usual low hum of activity was replaced with a strained quiet. People who normally nodded or offered a tight professional smile now found their computer screens intensely fascinating as I passed. They knew, or they suspected. In the corporate world, news of a public takedown travels faster than any official memo. I was marked. I sat at my desk, my island of order in a sea of silent judgment, and went through the motions of starting my day. I took a sip of water. I adjusted my monitor. Then I attempted to log into the legal tracker, the central nervous system of the firm's operations. Access denied. User credentials not recognized. Please contact IT support. There it was. The first domino. A quiet digital severing. They hadn't just taken away my ability to work. They had made me a non-entity. My 8 years of meticulous record-keeping, my entire professional footprint within the company erased with a single keystroke. It was a cowardly, efficient move designed to isolate and disorient. They were taking away my tools before they came for me. A moment later, an email notification popped up on my screen. My access to the legal server was gone, but my basic Outlook account was for the moment still active. The subject line was a masterpiece of corporate euphemism. Subject to conversation about your role evolution at Everhelm. It was from HR. Mason's fingerprints were all over the saccharine hollow language. The email spoke of the firm's dynamic new strategic direction and the need to realign key talent. It invited me to a meeting at 11 a.m. in a small windowless conference room on the HR floor, the room everyone knew as the Departure Lounge. The invitation was for a role transition discussion. It was signed by a junior HR manager I had never met. Mason couldn't even be bothered to fire me himself. I felt a flicker of something that might have been panic, but it was quickly extinguished by the cold, hard certainty of the plan I had already set in motion. They thought they were being clever. They thought they were 3 steps ahead, orchestrating a clean, quiet removal. They had no idea they were walking into a cage that had been built long before they even knew there was a threat. Because on Saturday, after sending the email from my LLC, I hadn't stopped. While Mason was likely celebrating his phantom victory at some exclusive brunch I was working, I had driven to a 24-hour copy shop in a different neighborhood, a place smelling of burnt toner and stale coffee. In my briefcase was a high-capacity encrypted flash drive. On that drive was my insurance policy. On Friday afternoon, before my access was cut, I had spent 2 hours methodically downloading everything. I wasn't just grabbing files. I was curating a narrative of incompetence, a timeline of arrogance written in metadata and digital signatures. I saved every version of the Northgate Agreement using the server's own version control log to create a clear, undeniable history of the changes Mason's team had made. I downloaded the internal chat logs from the legal team's channel, where my junior colleagues had raised concerns about the accelerated timeline concerns that were dismissed by Mason's M&A lieutenants. And most importantly, I isolated the golden thread, the full email chain from 3 weeks prior. It started with the independent auditor's initial query about Clause 9F. It showed my follow-up email to Mason flagging the issue and recommending the standard 2-day pause to resolve it. And it ended with his reply sent at 4:15 a.m. a time when hubris and fatigue often lead to mistakes. "Natalie," he had written, "I appreciate your diligence, but we are on an accelerated path. I'm making an executive decision to table this. We'll reconcile the validation post-transfer, authorizing a temporary hold on the conditions of 9F to proceed. Let's not let bureaucracy get in the way of a landmark deal." Attached to that email was his digital signature, an indelible court-admissible stamp of his recklessness. He had put it in writing. He had personally authorized the very breach he was now trying to bury me to conceal. At the copy shop, I printed it all. The crisp, clean paper sliding into the tray felt solid, real, a stark contrast to the ephemeral digital world where my existence was being deleted. I printed the email chain. I printed the server logs with their highlighted timestamps. I printed the side-by-side comparison of the original Clause 9F and the neutered version his team had tried to push through. Finally, I printed a fresh copy of the letter I had sent from Burke Strategic Legal Review. I compiled it all into a neat tabbed binder. It was no longer a collection of files. It was a dossier, an irrefutable case brief. On my way home, I stopped at a courier service. I placed the binder into a large tamper-proof envelope. The destination was not ironclad title and escrow. That would have been too direct, too confrontational. Instead, the package was addressed to the senior partner at Holland & Crane, the prestigious old-school law firm that acted as outside counsel for Ironclad. I was following the official, though rarely used, protocol for a third-party pre-transactional legal dispute. I was not a whistleblower. I was a concerned party presenting evidence to the escrow agent's legal representatives. It was a move they could not ignore. The package was sent for priority delivery, guaranteed to arrive before 9 a.m. on Monday. So as I sat at my desk, staring at the HR email, I knew that a copy of Mason's fatal mistake was at that very moment likely sitting on the polished desk of one of the city's most feared litigators. They thought they were revoking my access, but I had already moved the entire game to a new board, one where their rules didn't apply. The dominoes were set. The one they were about to push in the HR meeting was not the first in the chain. It was the very last. At precisely 10:55 a.m., I stood up from my desk. I left my laptop open, my single succulent standing guard. I did not take a bag, a notepad, or even a pen. I was not going to a meeting. I was attending a formality. A ghost visiting the scene of its own demise. The walk to the HR floor on the 12th story was a descent both literally and figuratively. I left the hushed, expensive quiet of the legal and executive floors with their dark wood original art and views of the city's ambition and entered a world of beige. The carpets were a nondescript beige, the walls a slightly different shade of beige, the cubicles a soul-crushing beige. The air itself seemed beige thick with the scent of photocopier toner and a kind of institutional despair. This was the firm's engine room, the place where human beings were processed like invoices. The conference room 12B had its door slightly ajar. Inside, a young woman with a nervous smile and a lanyard that identified her as Sarah HR Coordinator was arranging glasses around a carafe of water. She looked up as I entered, her smile faltering for a second as she saw my face. I offered none in return. "Natalie, hi, thanks for coming. Mason will be right with us." She gestured to a chair. I sat, my posture perfect, my hands resting calmly in my lap. The silence in the windowless room was absolute. It felt like a soundproofed box designed to contain difficult conversations. A minute later, the door swung open and Mason Crowley entered. He was the picture of effortless power, dressed in a suit so sharply tailored it looked like it was molded to him. He carried a single leather-bound folder. He flashed a brilliant predatory smile first at Sarah, then at me. "Natalie, thanks for your flexibility," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. He sat opposite me, placing the folder squarely in the center of the table. "I wanted to have this conversation personally because I have a great deal of respect for the work you've done for us over the years." The lie was so bald, so utterly transparent that it was almost impressive. I said nothing. I simply watched him. I noticed his watch was worth more than my car. I noticed a single, almost invisible piece of lint on his dark lapel. My mind had detached, retreating to a place of cold observation. The woman he was speaking to was a stranger to me now, a character in a play whose lines I no longer needed to learn. He opened the folder. "As we discussed in the strategy meeting, Everhelm is moving in a new, more agile direction. We're pivoting our focus, and that means our organizational structure has to evolve as well." He slid a single piece of paper across the table toward me. "We've been reevaluating roles, and unfortunately, the traditional contract specialist position you occupy is being phased out in favor of a more integrated software-driven approach." I glanced down at the paper. It was a termination notice filled with the same hollow, meaningless jargon he was spouting. "Now, ma'am," he continued, leaning forward conspiratorially as if we were partners in this, "I know this is difficult news. And I want to be clear, this is not a reflection on your performance. You're an incredible asset. In fact, you're almost too valuable, too specialized for the broader, more dynamic projects we have on the horizon. But your current role, it just doesn't align with our forward strategy." He spoke of me as if I were a piece of legacy software being decommissioned, an old version that was no longer compatible with the new operating system. I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound, bottomless weariness. This was the final betrayal. Not just the firing, but the suffocating, condescending kindness of it. The pretense that this was for some greater good and not simply to cover his own fatal incompetence. He then pulled out 2 more documents from his folder. "The firm wants to make this transition as smooth as possible for you. We've put together a severance proposal." He pushed it towards me. I didn't need to read it. I could feel its inadequacy from across the table. "It's 3 weeks' salary, and of course we'll need you to sign a standard non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement." He tapped the last document, a thick stack of paper bound by a heavy clip. "The NDA, the gag order, the price of my silence. 3 weeks' pay for 8 years of my life in exchange for a promise to never speak of the secrets I kept, including the one that could ruin him." He smiled again, that polished, empty smile. "I'm sure you'll find it's a very generous offer. Sarah can walk you through the details." This was the moment. The moment he expected me to crumble or to argue or to plead. The moment he would offer some final patronizing words of encouragement before having me escorted from the building. But I didn't look at the papers. I didn't look at Sarah, who was staring at her hands as if praying for this to be over. I looked directly at Mason Crowley. I saw him not as the CEO's son, not as my boss, but as a hollow man, a ghost playing at being a king. His power was a costume, and I could see the flimsy stitching. In that moment, all the hope, all the residual loyalty, all the naive belief that hard work and integrity would be rewarded, it all evaporated. There was nothing left to be betrayed. I held his gaze for a long, silent beat. I watched the confidence in his eyes waver, replaced by a flicker of confusion. My silence was not in his script. I stood up slowly, my chair making no sound on the beige carpet. "I will provide my response in writing," I said. My voice was quiet, but it filled the small dead room. It was as cold and clear as ice. "Through my legal representative." I did not offer a handshake. I did not say thank you. I turned, walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out, closing it gently behind me. I left the three of them, Mason Sarah, and the ghost of Natalie Burke, contract specialist, sitting in that airless beige box surrounded by the useless pieces of paper that were supposed to be the end of my story. They had no idea that they were the ones who were truly trapped. I didn't go back to my desk. To do so would have been to acknowledge that I still belonged there, that some part of me was still Natalie Burke, contract specialist. That person was gone. I walked directly to the elevator bank, my steps measured and even on the polished marble floor. I could feel the invisible ripple of my passage, the furtive glances from receptionists and passing executives. They saw a woman who had just been fired, a ghost walking herself out of the building. I let them. Their perception was no longer my reality. The elevator ride down was a silent, swift decompression. 47 floors of pressurized ambition, of muted tones and artificial light, fell away above me. When the doors opened into the grand sunlit lobby, it felt like surfacing. I walked past the soaring ficus trees and the security desk, not with the hurried, defeated shuffle of the newly unemployed, but with the calm purpose of someone heading to her next appointment. The security guard, a man I'd nodded to thousands of times, simply gave me his usual nod. He didn't know he was witnessing an exodus. Outside the New York City air hit me a chaotic symphony of taxi horns, distant sirens, and the smell of roasted nuts from a street vendor. It was real. It was messy. And it was free. I didn't look back at the gleaming monolithic tower of Everhelm Partners. It was already becoming a part of my past. My destination was a small, independent coffee shop 3 blocks away. A place with mismatched chairs, the rich, acrid smell of burnt coffee, and free, unsecured Wi-Fi. It was anonymous, functional, and utterly devoid of corporate beige. I found a small table in the back, ordered a large black coffee, and opened my personal laptop. This was my new office, my command center. My hands did not shake as I logged into the email account for Burke Strategic Legal Review, LLC. The time for emotion had passed in that windowless room. Now was the time for execution. The first email I had sent on Saturday was a warning shot, a polite inquiry aimed at the escrow agent's legal counsel. It was designed to plant a seed of doubt, to get the lawyers asking questions of their client. The response I was about to write was the canon itself. It was going directly to Alistair Finch, the senior escrow officer, and it would be a formal demand, not an inquiry. My role had evolved. I was no longer an independent firm raising a concern. I was the legal representative for a party with a material claim, my own. I began to type the words, flowing with a chilling precision. Via email. Urgent action required. Subject: formal demand to place administrative hold. Escrow account 774A2 NRTG. Dear Mr. Finch, pursuant to my firm's previous correspondence dated Saturday's date, this letter serves as a formal and immediate demand to place a temporary non-discretionary administrative hold on all funds held in the above-referenced escrow account. The language was hard, unequivocal. Formal demand. Immediate. Non-discretionary. This was not a request he could ponder. It was a legal directive that, if ignored, would place him and his firm in a position of significant liability. An escrow agent's primary duty is to neutrality and the strict enforcement of the contract. I was now accusing one party of violating that contract, forcing the agent to act as a shield. This action is necessitated by the discovery of a material breach in the procedural execution of the governing agreement, specifically the conditions precedent for the transfer of funds as detailed in Clause 9F. Escrow security and third-party audit compliance have not been met. An internal directive was issued by a representative of Everhelm Partners to bypass the mandatory third-party audit validation, thereby nullifying the contractually required transfer trigger delay. I was no longer suggesting a possible conflict. I was declaring a material breach, and I was naming the cause an internal directive from Everhelm. As the escrow agent, Ironclad Title and Escrow has a fiduciary duty to all parties to ensure the terms of the agreement are followed with absolute fidelity. The disbursement of funds under these compromised circumstances would constitute a gross violation of that duty. This was the core of the argument. I was reminding him of his legal obligation, the bedrock of his entire profession. Therefore, we demand that the $300 million, $300, $1,000, be held in situ until such time as the procedural breach of Clause 9F is fully rectified and its proper execution is confirmed in writing by all original signatories and their legal representatives. As you know, such a hold is standard practice and can remain in effect for a period of up to 30 days to allow for resolution. And there it was, the timeline. 30 days, a lifetime in the world of corporate finance. Then I prepared the final fatal blow. I opened the file I had saved from Mason's email, the one sent at 4:15 a.m. I converted the entire email chain into a single clean PDF. The header, the timestamp, his name, his words, authorizing a temporary hold on the conditions of 9F to proceed, and his embedded digital signature. I saved the file with a simple, devastating name, Exhibit A, Authorization for Procedural Deviation, M. Crowley. I attached the PDF to the email. The little paperclip icon appeared next to the subject line. It looked so small, so innocuous. But it was everything. It was the proof. It transformed my letter from an allegation into a documented fact. I reread the entire email one last time. It was perfect. Cold, professional, and backed by undeniable evidence. My finger hovered over the mouse. This was the point of no return. The moment the quiet war turned loud. I clicked send. I closed my laptop and took a slow sip of my coffee. It was bitter just the way I liked it. Outside, the city roared on, oblivious. But I knew what I had just done. I hadn't just thrown a wrench into the works. I had triggered a system shutdown, and I had timed it perfectly. Everhelm's quarterly earnings call with their shareholders was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 8 days from now. Announcing the successful closing of the Northgate acquisition was meant to be the centerpiece of that call, the blockbuster news that would send the stock price soaring and cement Mason's reputation as a wunderkind. Without that $300 million officially on the books, their earnings would fall short of projections. They wouldn't have a victory to announce. They would have a catastrophe to explain. They needed that money. They needed it next week. And I had just locked it in a vault for 30 days with the only key in my pocket. The email confirmation from Alistair Finch's office arrived 2 hours later. It was a model of bureaucratic efficiency, a mere 3 sentences long and colder than a morgue slab. Ms. Burke. This email serves to confirm receipt of your formal demand regarding escrow account number 774A2 NRTG. Pursuant to our standard protocols and the evidence presented in your Exhibit A, a temporary administrative hold has been placed on the account effective immediately pending further clarification from all involved parties. A formal notification has been dispatched to the legal representatives of both Everhelm Partners and Northgate Holdings. Regards. Office of Alistair Finch. Senior Escrow. Officer Ironclad. Title and Escrow. I read it 3 times. Effective immediately. The circuit was broken. The flow of capital had stopped. The $300 million prize was now locked in a digital vault, and the silence that followed was no longer the silence of my isolation. It was the silence of a stalled machine. I closed my laptop, paid for my coffee, and walked out into the afternoon sun. I did not need to be in the building to hear the explosion. I could feel the shockwave from miles away. I spent the rest of the day in a self-imposed exile, wandering through the city's anonymous crowds, through museums and parks. I was untethered, a ghost in my own life, waiting. I knew what was happening inside that glass tower. I could picture it with the vivid clarity of a recurring nightmare. The first notification from Ironclad would have landed in the inbox of Everhelm's general counsel, a perpetually stressed man named David Chenning. He would have read it, his face slowly losing all color. His first call would not have been to Mason, but to Mason's father, the CEO. From there, the fire would have spread through the executive floor with unimaginable speed. Conference calls would have been initiated with the abrupt, panicked energy of a national emergency. Members of the board of directors, pulled from golf courses and long lunches, would be patched in their voices sharp with a fury that only the sudden, unexpected evaporation of 9 figures of capital can inspire. And at the center of that firestorm would be Mason. I could see him in the main boardroom, the same one where he had dismissed me, but the dynamics would be inverted. He wouldn't be the confident visionary at the head of the table. He would be the defendant in the dock. The PowerPoint presentation would be off the room, lit by the cold, unforgiving fluorescent lights. He would be sweating in his $1,000 suit. His first move, I knew, would be to lie. It was the reflex of the privileged and the cornered. "It's a systems error," he might say first, or "the seller is trying to pull a fast one." But my Exhibit A, would have been forwarded to everyone on the call. My name wouldn't even be the main issue at first. The issue would be his signature. So he would pivot to his second, more calculated lie. He would blame the machine, not the man. The legal department failed to update the master documents in the tracker. He would insist, his voice tight with manufactured indignation. I was operating off the information I was given. This is a clerical error on their end. On her end. He would try to throw my ghost under the bus, one last time, painting me as the disgruntled, incompetent employee whose mistake had caused this mess. But that lie had a half-life of about 5 minutes. Because David Chenning, the general counsel, was a lawyer. A cautious, meticulous, cover-your-ass lawyer. He would have already initiated a full forensic audit with the IT department. And that's when the chief technology officer, a quiet, brilliant man named Kenji Tanaka, would have been pulled in. Kenji didn't care about politics or strategy. He cared about data. Data is pure. Data tells the truth. Kenji would have traced the digital breadcrumbs back not just for a few weeks, but for years. He would have bypassed the user-facing legal tracker and gone deep into the system's core, into the immutable write-once backup vaults, where the firm's entire history was preserved in digital amber. And in that vault, he would have found the original Northgate Agreement. He would have run a diagnostic on the metadata of Clause 9F. And there, under the field labeled Originator, he would have found a single entry, Burke Natalie. He would find more. The timestamps would be Mason's executioner. They would show that the version of the contract Mason claimed he was working from, the updated one, was only created after he signed the bypass authorization. The digital record would prove he hadn't been given the wrong document. He had actively ignored the right one. The server logs were not just data points. They were witnesses, and they did not lie. By late afternoon, the narrative inside Everhelm would have irrevocably shifted. The problem was no longer an external attack or a clerical error. It was a self-inflicted wound administered by the CEO's son. My role in it would have transformed too. I was no longer the disgruntled employee. I was the system's fail-safe. The ghost in the machine who had activated the alarm. The final official confirmation of this new reality would have come from Ironclad's outside counsel, Holland and Crane. Their lawyers, having reviewed my dossier and conferred with their client, would have sent a second, more detailed letter to Everhelm. It would have stated in dense, unforgiving legalese their official position: the administrative hold was non-negotiable. The $300 million would not be released until a formal, legally binding resolution, clarifying the status and execution of Clause 9F, was signed by all parties. They would not accept an internal memo or an executive override. They would require a full contractual amendment, an admission of the initial error, and the explicit written consent of the seller's legal team to the revised terms. The weight of my silence had become immense. On Friday, it was the silence of a woman who had been dismissed. By Monday afternoon, it was the silence of a locked vault, the silence of a pending disaster. The pressure was no longer on me to explain myself. The pressure was on Everhelm. And the clock was ticking not toward a triumphant acquisition, but toward a catastrophic earnings call. The string was pulled taut, and I just had to wait for it to snap. For 2 days I heard nothing. It was a silence louder than any shouting a void, where the frantic, panicked energy of an imploding corporation was being contained behind the soundproofed walls of the 47th floor. I knew they were scrambling, exploring every angle, every legal loophole, every possible way to regain control without having to speak to the ghost who had brought them to a standstill. I let them. Time was my ally. With every passing hour, their desperation grew, and my position solidified. The quarterly earnings call was a fixed point in their future, a looming iceberg, and they were the ones steaming toward it at full speed. The call came on Wednesday afternoon. The caller ID was a block number. I let it ring 3 times before answering my voice, a calm, neutral hello. Ms. Burke. The voice was female, crisp, and professional. It held none of the nervous energy of the HR coordinator or the forced bonhomie of an executive. It was the voice of someone who managed the life of a very powerful person. This is Eleanor Vance, executive assistant to Mr. Crowley Sr. He would like to request a meeting with you at your earliest convenience. Request a meeting, not summon me. At my earliest convenience, not at 11 a.m. The language of power had been recalibrated. I can be available tomorrow morning, I said. Of course. The main boardroom, 47th floor at 10 a.m. Mr. Crowley felt it would be the most appropriate venue. The most appropriate venue. It was a concession, a symbolic acknowledgement. They were forcing themselves to return to the scene of their arrogance, to face me on the same ground where they had cast me out. That will be acceptable, I said, and ended the call. The next morning, I dressed not in the muted professional grays of Natalie Burke contract specialist, but in a sharply tailored black pantsuit. My hair was pulled back, severe and elegant. My face was a neutral mask. I was not returning as a supplicant or a vengeful employee. I was attending as the principal of Burke Strategic Legal Review, LLC, a firm that currently held $300 million of their capital hostage. When I stepped off the elevator onto the 47th floor, the atmosphere was funereal. The executive assistant, Ms. Vance, was waiting for me. She was an older woman with intelligent, weary eyes. She nodded respectfully. Ms. Burke, they're ready for you. She led me to the familiar glass doors of the boardroom. But as I walked in, the scene was profoundly different. At the long mahogany table sat 4 men, Mr. Crowley Sr., the CEO at the head, David Chenning, the general counsel, the firm's chief financial officer, and another man I recognized as a senior member of the board. They were the architects of the firm's power, and as I entered the room, all 4 of them stood up. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was everything. It was a formal acknowledgement of a shift in the gravitational center of the room. I was no longer a subordinate. I was a sovereign entity. Mason Crowley's chair was empty. His absence was a roar, a silent admission of guilt, a strategic retreat designed to lower the temperature of the room. It didn't matter. He was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was a culture of arrogance that I was here to cure. Ms. Burke, the CEO said. His voice was a low, gravelly sound accustomed to absolute command. He was a man in his late 60s with a face that looked like it had been carved from a mountainside. He did not smile. He did not offer condolences for my dismissal. He gestured to the chair directly opposite him. Please, thank you for coming. I walked to the chair and sat. Ms. Vance closed the doors behind me, leaving the 5 of us in the suspended silence of the glass cage overlooking the city. Mr. Crowley Sr. folded his hands on the polished table. He looked directly at me, his eyes holding a kind of grudging, pragmatic respect. The look a king might give to the leader of a rival army who had successfully laid siege to his castle. He wasted no time on pleasantries or pretenses. The time for that was over. "We find ourselves in a difficult position, Ms. Burke," he said, his voice flat. "A position of our own making, it seems. The administrative hold on the Northgate funds is problematic for us, especially this week." He paused, letting the understatement hang in the air. "I'm not going to waste your time with corporate platitudes, so let me be direct. What are the terms to have your firm withdraw its complaint?" There it was. The question. Raw, transactional, and utterly devoid of the empty jargon, the role flexibility, the new strategic directions that had defined my exit. This was the real conversation, the one that always happens behind closed doors when the facades have crumbled. I met his gaze and did not flinch. My voice when I spoke was as calm and steady as my hands, which were resting lightly on the table in front of me. "My terms are not complicated, Mr. Crowley," I began, "but they are non-negotiable." I saw the CFO shift in his seat. The general counsel simply watched me, his face unreadable. "First," I said, "is the issue of intellectual property. Over my 8 years here, outside the standard scope of my duties, I developed a proprietary framework of risk mitigation clauses. The Covenant Series, I called it. Clause 9F is a part of that series. It is my work, my intellectual creation. Everhelm will formally recognize in a legally binding and notarized document my sole authorship and ownership of that framework. You may continue to use it, but you will do so under a formal licensing agreement with my company, for which there will be an annual fee." I paused. This was not about money. It was about legacy. They would not be allowed to erase my contribution. They would pay to use the very tools they had once taken for granted. "Second," I continued, "is my future relationship with this firm. I will not be returning as an employee. The trust required for that arrangement has been irrevocably broken. Instead, Everhelm will retain Burke Strategic Legal Review LLC as its independent contract oversight consultant. My firm will be responsible for the final audit and validation of all transactions valued at over $50 million. I will not report to any department head. I will report directly to a special oversight committee consisting of the general counsel and one member of the board. My findings will be independent, and my recommendations binding." I was no longer the invisible failsafe. I was making myself the visible, empowered, and unavoidable final checkpoint. I would be the firewall. "Finally," I said, my gaze sweeping across the 4 men. "My firm's compensation. We will require a significant annual retainer and a fee for each transaction we oversee, calculated as a small percentage of the total deal value. My legal representative will forward the proposed fee schedule this afternoon." I finished speaking. The silence that filled the room was heavy, thick with the weight of calculation. The CFO was pale. David Chenning looked relieved. He was a lawyer. He understood the value of an airtight process. I had just offered him one. But it was the CEO I watched. He hadn't moved. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. He was doing the math, but not just the financial math. He was calculating the cost of my proposal against the cost of a public implosion. The cost of a failed acquisition, a disastrous earnings call, a shattered reputation for his son, and a shareholder revolt. "These are your terms," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "These are my terms," I confirmed. "You have until 5 p.m. today to accept. If you do, I will have the complaint withdrawn by morning, and I will personally oversee the successful and correct execution of the Northgate transfer. If you do not, the 30-day hold remains in effect. The choice is yours." I stood up. I had said everything I needed to say. I had inverted the power structure of the room. I was no longer the redundant overhead. I was the architect, and they were the ones who had to decide if they were willing to pay the price to live in the house I had built. The 5 p.m. deadline came and went in the quiet of my apartment. I did not watch the clock. I did not pace. I sat by the window watching the afternoon light soften and bleed into the bruised purple of early evening, and I read a novel. The world of the book was a welcome distraction, a place of fictional conflicts that had no bearing on my own. I was calm. The ball was in their court, and I had already calculated every possible way they could return it. All of them ended in my favor. At 5:47 p.m., my personal cell phone, a number known only to a handful of people, buzzed on the table beside me. The caller was David Chenning. "Natalie," he said, his voice flat with exhaustion. There was no preamble. "We accept your terms. My office will have the preliminary agreements drafted and sent to your legal representative for review by 9 a.m. tomorrow. We'd like to schedule the signing for noon if that's agreeable." "Noon is fine," I replied. "I'll expect the drafts." "They will be there," he said. And then after a slight pause, he added something I did not expect. "For what it's worth, well played." He hung up before I could respond. The signing took place not in the grand boardroom, but in a smaller, more sterile conference room in the offices of Everhelm's outside counsel. The table was a block of white marble. The chairs were chrome and black leather. The air was cold. On one side of the table sat Mr. Crowley Sr. and David Chenning. On my side sat myself and the lawyer I had retained that morning, an older, unflappable man named Marcus Thorne, who had reviewed and tightened the agreements with the quiet glee of a master craftsman. There was no small talk. We were not colleagues reuniting. We were two sovereign powers signing a treaty after a brief, decisive war. The documents were laid out before us in a neat, intimidating row. The first was the Independent Contractor Agreement. It officially retained Burke Strategic Legal Review, LLC, as an oversight consultant. It detailed the scope of my authority, my direct line of reporting to the board's oversight committee, and the fee structure I had demanded. I was no longer a salaried employee with a 401k. I was a high-priced specialist, my value quantified in retainers and percentage points. My signature on that document felt like I was closing a door on one life and opening another. The second was the Intellectual Property Licensing Agreement. This one was my victory made manifest. It stated in clear, unambiguous language that the framework known as the Covenant Series, including but not limited to Clause 9F, was the sole and original creation of Natalie Burke. It granted Everhelm Partners a non-exclusive terminable license to use this IP for a significant annual fee. My name, my work was no longer a footnote. It was a capitalized, trademarked asset. They had tried to erase me, and now my name was permanently embedded in their legal architecture, a name they had to pay for the privilege of using. As I was preparing to sign, Mr. Crowley slid a single heavy vellum envelope across the table. My name was typed on the front. "This is for you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A formality, but a necessary one." I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of the CEO's personal letterhead. It was not a handwritten note of apology. It was a corporate instrument, every word chosen with a lawyer's precision. "Dear Ms. Burke, on behalf of the executive leadership of Everhelm Partners, I wish to extend a formal apology for the circumstances that led to the termination of your employment. The assessment of your role as redundant was a significant error in judgment and is not a reflection of the high esteem in which the firm holds your contributions over the past 8 years. The handling of the situation was inconsistent with our company's values, and we deeply regret the lack of professionalism you were shown. We look forward to our new productive partnership. Sincerely, Harrison Crowley, Chief Executive Officer, Everhelm Partner." It was a cold, bloodless document designed to be entered as evidence in a future lawsuit if needed. It was an admission of fault just sufficient enough to be considered an apology, but nothing more. And yet it was enough. I folded it and placed it in my briefcase without comment. I had not done this for an apology. I had done this for justice, and justice is rarely warm. With the agreement signed and copies exchanged, there was one final piece of business. David Chenning placed a final document on the table. It was a joint letter addressed to Alistair Finch at Ironclad Title and Escrow. It had been drafted by both his legal team and mine. It was the instrument of my public vindication. I read the key paragraph, the one Marcus and I had fought for all morning. Everhelm Partners formally acknowledges a procedural oversight in the execution of the preliminary conditions of the Northgate Holdings transaction. Specifically, the activation of the transfer was initiated prior to the required third-party audit validation as stipulated in Clause 9F of the governing agreement. Therefore, Everhelm Partners confirms and agrees that the original unamended version of Clause 9F, as authored by Natalie Burke, holds precedent, and its conditions must be met in full prior to disbursement. All parties are now in agreement, and we jointly authorize Ironclad Title and Escrow to proceed with the execution of said clause and release the administrative hold upon its successful completion. They had been forced to put it in writing. Procedural oversight, as authored by Natalie Burke, holds precedent. It was a confession and a concession, a complete capitulation disguised in the dry language of the law. I pushed the signed copy back across the table to David. My work here was done. The mechanism of my revenge was now complete, codified, notarized, and filed. I had not returned to Everhelm Partners. I had, in a way, consumed it, becoming a permanent, unremovable part of its most critical functions, all on my own terms. There was no joy in it, only the profound, ice-cold satisfaction of a perfectly balanced equation. The news of Mason Crowley's fate arrived not through an official channel, but in the way all true corporate gossip travels, as a carefully worded, strategically leaked memo that found its way to an industry blog. He wasn't fired. The sons of CEOs are never fired. He was being temporarily reassigned to explore strategic growth initiatives in our international development division. It was a classic corporate exile, a golden parachute dropping him into a prestigious-sounding non-job in London or Singapore, far from the levers of actual power. He was being sent away to the corporate equivalent of a distant country manor to reflect on his indiscretions. His LinkedIn profile was updated overnight, his title stripped of the powerful mergers and acquisitions, and replaced with the vague and impotent strategic projects. His triumphant post about the record-breaking deal had been quietly deleted. The Everhelm Partners stock EHP on the New York Stock Exchange opened down 2.5 points on the day of the earnings call. The financial news attributed it to market uncertainty following a delayed but successfully closed major acquisition. They had made their announcement, but the slight stutter, the week-long delay, was a drop of blood in the water, and the sharks of Wall Street had noticed. It wasn't a catastrophe, just a hairline fracture in the firm's monolithic facade of invincibility. A small permanent scar that only a few people in the world knew how to read. I was one of them. I read all this from my own apartment, a place that no longer felt like a temporary refuge from the office, but like the headquarters of my entire world. The air was different. The light was different. It was the air and light of a place that belonged to me, not to them. I spent the morning setting up my new life. I converted my spare bedroom into a proper office, not just a desk in a corner. I ordered a new computer, a new printer, a small secure server. I filed the necessary paperwork to open a business bank account for Burke Strategic Legal Review, LLC. Each step was a quiet, deliberate act of construction. For 8 years, I had built fortresses for others. Now I was finally building one for myself. Late in the afternoon, after a series of calls with my new bank and my lawyer, I felt a familiar craving. I went into my kitchen, ground fresh coffee beans, the expensive kind I rarely bought when I was just an employee, and performed the slow, meticulous ritual of a pour-over. The rich, dark aroma filled the quiet apartment. It was the smell of a deliberate pause of control. As I poured the steaming coffee into my favorite mug, my laptop sitting on the kitchen counter chimed with a new email notification. It wasn't from David Chenning or anyone at Everhelm. The sender was EHP Accounts Payable. The subject line was a string of numbers and letters and invoice code. I walked over, mug in hand, and clicked it open. It was a standard payment confirmation receipt. A PDF attachment detailed the transaction. My eyes scanned past the boilerplate, past the reference numbers, to the two most important lines. Invoice number 01, BSLR, LLC. Amount paid $150,000. $150,000. It was my initial retainer and the oversight fee for the successful and correct closing of the Northgate deal. It was more than my previous annual salary paid out for 1 week of work. The work of saving them from themselves. The money wasn't the point, but it was a potent symbol. It was the physical manifestation of my new reality. It was the price of their mistake and the value of my expertise. I stared at the number on the screen. There was no surge of elation, no desire to pop a bottle of champagne or call a friend to celebrate. The victory was too personal, too profound for that. It was a quiet, deep, and resonant satisfaction. The feeling of a complex equation finally being solved, of a story reaching its inevitable just conclusion. I took a sip of my coffee. It was perfect. I didn't reply to the email. I didn't call David Chenning to confirm receipt. My silence had become my greatest asset, and I saw no reason to relinquish it now. The transaction spoke for itself. Later that evening, I sat in my new office. I created a new digital folder on my secure server for my very first client, Everhelm Partners. I saved the signed contracts, the IP agreement, the CEO's apology letter. Then I opened a new document, a simple text file I named Client Notes, EHP. I typed only a single line into the file, a private mantra for my new company, a reminder of the foundation upon which it was built. It was a promise to myself, a piece of fine print for my own soul. Clause 9F. Never forget who wrote the fine print. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and consider hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.